Okay, so final topic in the second theme, so creating a welfare state. So it's essentially educational opportunities. The overarching question, and I found that I quite like this topic because from what I can tell, there is in all likelihood the most common question you will get will be something about how far educational reform creates widening opportunity. A lot of topics have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 types of questions they could ask. I reckon they could still have another type of question, but I think the overwhelming focus, or the focus of this topic, for the most part, is very simply, does educational reform create or lead to widening opportunity? You can, of course, as usual, get some kind of causation question, as you can for all the sub-themes, but if it's not a causation question, then I think it is, I cannot see what they would ask aside from, does X change lead to widening opportunity? Or they might have a more specific point that has a more restricted time period, but I think it would still be something about how far educational or widening opportunity has been created. So, let's make a start. So, once again, we begin with looking at the situation or the context before 1918. So, the context of education in this country, in the 20th century, is a very simple one. For the vast majority of people, formal education plays no role in their lives. Historically, schools are something which are basically a rarity. When they do exist, they are run by churches, charities, private individuals / foundations. So, for example, if you ever look at most private schools, they're often named after people in a lot of cases, and very often, or not rather, but if you look at their history, it's always a case of X really famous or significant philanthropist in this local area decided to create a local school for the children and develops out of that, something like that. All the major private schools, the older ones in particular, even a lot of grammar schools have historic schools that are basically created by private individuals. So schools will almost always be church-run, charity-run, or private individual / endowment, and that basically sets up a school in the long run, or the long term. After 1902, more opportunities are created or provided for working class children to go to school after the government starts to fund these grammar schools, who also, in return, so let's talk about grammar schools historically. Grammar schools historically charge fees. Not the grammar schools that get created mid of the century. Grammar schools actually used to charge fees. So the government starts to fund the grammar schools, and in return, those same schools will basically offer places in their schools to non-fee paying students. However, by 1918, it's a very simple context. There are very few children in school, and especially in secondary school. Secondary education and above, you'll get kids in elementary, but secondary education and above, it remains primarily the reserve of upper and middle class children. And that's the basic context. So what I'm going to do is, the way I'm going to structure this, I'm going to keep it quite straightforward actually for this one, as opposed to the other lectures. I'm literally going to go through ways in which you could argue that opportunity is widened between 1918 to 45, and ways in which you could say that widened opportunity was actually limited for that same period. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing for the post-war period. In what ways could we argue that opportunity was widened in the post-war system? And in what ways could you argue that actually opportunities weren't so great? So, the first point. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is this act that gets passed in 1918. Most important, there are 2 main actions to be aware of this time frame. The really big one, there's the 1918 Education Act, often referred to as the Fisher Act, because the guy calls it Fisher. So Fisher Act, Education Act, whatever you want to call it, the 1918 Fisher Education Act, whatever. And it basically introduces the following main changes. First of all, the school leaving age is increased to 14, okay? The second thing it does is, it scraps all fees for elementary education. So elementary education is what you would think of today as being like primary education. So it scraps all fees for elementary education, and it also transfers funding in a lot of these schools from local education authorities, LEAs, to the central government. So there are two main consequences of this act, which you can argue that actually it does help to increase opportunity or widen opportunity. First of all, because it scraps these fees for elementary education, and also because it forces us to stay in school for long and raises the leaving age, more children are staying in school for longer. So the percentage of 11 to 14-year-olds in school by 1938 is almost 75%. So three-quarters of the population are in education between 11 to 14. That's the first thing. Yeah.
Does that mean that the central government funded it instead of the local education?
Yeah. And so that's the same point you're asking about. So yeah, so moving funding from the local authorities or the local education authorities to the central government, the idea behind it was that it would result in teachers' pensions, in improvements rather, in teachers' pensions and salaries. The idea behind that is if you're paying them more and they've got better sort of perks for their job, it would help to improve school standard because you can sort of recruit a higher quality of teacher, or there can be some more motivation as well. So again, you've got a situation where with teachers now being paid higher wages, it helps to also improve school standards. So the Fisher Act therefore helps to improve educational opportunity, you could say. That's the first major act which is passed, which is the Fisher Act. The second major act, which you need to be aware of, so you could have an entire point about how the Fisher Act helps to create, how it helps to widen opportunity. The second major act which gets passed is in 1944, you have the Butler Education Act. Now I'm going to give you guys a warning about this act to begin with. Because in some of the essays that I've marked, I've seen this mistake made. You really, in these essays, need to watch out for the dates. The Butler Education Act has a couple of really important provisions. One of them is the tripartite system. I'm going to talk about that later. That's about grammar schools. Although the tripartite system is proposed in the 1944 Butler Act, they technically aren't brought in until after 1945. Therefore, if you, and this is I'm going to caveat it again, if you have a question about 1918 to 45, don't talk about grammar schools. Don't talk about tripartite system. From what I can tell, so I've looked at the mark schemes and all the specimen papers, it mentions nothing about that. So my impression is, they will not accept it for this question. That comes into the next period. So don't talk about tripartite system, even though it is mentioned in the Butler Act. Anyway, so I'll come back to the Butler Act. So, the other important provisions of it which you can talk about for this period are, it raises the school leaving age to 15, which is the first thing. The really big one though, is it provides free secondary education to all students. Okay? So for the first time now, so this really builds upon the changes, or this really builds upon the changes that made in the Fisher Act, which made elementary education free and raised the school leaving age. It's raised the leaving age even further. So for the first time now, secondary education is now available free to all children in the country without any restrictions. And so there are millions of people who can now attend secondary education for the first time. Or millions more can attend for the first time. So if you talk about the Butler Act, those are the main two things to focus on. The fact that the Butler Act helps more students stay in secondary education because it raises the leaving age to 15 and also scraps fees, which previously were preventing students from carrying on education. Of a certain point. The next point you can talk about, so this is another thing by the way, when you look at education, we're looking at both schools and further education. So you can always, and this is the way in which when you're in exams, do not forget you can talk about both, well, unless it specifies otherwise. So I'm going to caveat that. Unless it specifies otherwise, if it talks about widening opportunity, you can usually talk about both universities and schools. But anyway, so the next way in which opportunity widens is through greater availability or opportunity for university education. So you've got, in this period, a greater number of bright working class kids, and also middle class students able to access university more than before. You've got places like Oxbridge remaining kind of the preserve of the elite, but provincial universities, so you have in this time period, a lot of these new provincial universities, places like Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, they get created during this time, and they're trying to expand at this point. And so one of the ways in which they're able to expand is by recruiting more middle class and some bright working class kids. And so the expansion of these universities, or the creation of them rather, provides more places for kids, and then often they go to middle class students, even though Oxbridge remains for the elites. There's actually more places to go around in the first place. The second thing which also allows them to improve their access is there is a greater availability of grant schemes and scholarships provided by local educational authorities that allow kids to basically go on to university. So the best example of this is the government or the government schemes. And so the best example of this is the government teacher training scheme. So the government basically will agree to fund a student's university education in exchange for that person committing to teach to teach for a certain amount of time afterwards. So again, these you have increasingly a greater number of avenues for people to go to university who perhaps might not have financial means, through sort of local authority grants or even central government-funded schemes as well. So, all in all, yeah, you can argue that university education access doesn't improve in this period. However, the drawbacks, so what are the limits? First things first, go back to schools. Post-14, secondary education remains limited to working class children, okay? So, although the Fisher Act, we talked about how it increases the school leaving age to 14, very few students remain in school after that age. So, although, for example, by 1938, there were 75% of students in secondary education. I cannot remember the exact numbers, but I know that the number of students in secondary education after 14 drops substantially. The numbers fall off a cliff, basically. And so, there are very few kids who actually continue in education after the compulsory phase ends, and even fewer going to gain university places. Yeah, so actually, no, I have another one actually as well. I didn't see that yet. So the number is, so in 1938, so we talked about how 11 to 14, the number is 75%. By 1938, so that's the same year, if you look at 15 to 18-year-old kids, only 6.6% remain in school. Okay? So in other words, the point is, after the compulsory phase ends, they take them out. And so part of the reason behind that is the fact that they cannot afford to keep their kids in school in the first place due to the costs in many cases. And another side of it is, especially again, if you think about other themes, given the poverty which is rampant in large parts of the country in the 20s and 30s, and particularly in the 30s, it's not economically viable to have your child out of work. So as soon as they're able to take their kids out of school to go into work, that is what a lot of working class families do, because it's necessary for that family's income. So, in particular for working class kids, post-14 education is quite rare. So secondary school really is for middle class kids, yes.
So when you say they can't afford to keep their kids in school, is that because they need them to work? Both
reasons. So one reason is they'll have to actually, in some cases, they'll have to still pay for secondary education.
What about the Fisher thing though?
That's elementary. So the Fisher Act abolishes elementary fees, so primary basically. But after a certain age, you still, I'm not sure exactly what schools have to pay. So not every kid's paying for secondary education, but it's not free. Secondary education is not available to everyone in the country. So there are some working class families who would actually have to pay money for their kids to go to school. And yeah, so there's the two sides of it: the school fees, and of course finding work. And then the second thing as well is grants themselves. We talked about how grants are increasingly available for kids to go to university or for kids to claim university places. However, a lot of those grants, there weren't that many to go around. So as a result, the competition the competition was quite fierce for these grants. So unless you're the absolute brightest students, sort of working class backgrounds, you would have no chance of going to university because you wouldn't actually be able to get those grants. So most people actually miss out. And so there is some change, but it is limited in that sense. Additionally, again, if we actually look at the quality of the education, so we talked about how the Fisher Act shifts funding from the local authorities to the central government, and therefore, as a result, teachers are getting better salaries, better pensions, and the hope was that education standards would improve, which they did slightly. Having said that, the quality of education still does, in many areas, particularly working class areas, remain quite poor. So it's all well and good having free elementary education, but then you've got very variable class sizes. So in some locations, you will have classes of up to 50, even 60 kids on occasion within a classroom. So class sizes are extremely, Class sizes are extremely difficult to keep down, and so that negatively impacts on the quality of the learning. In particular, if you have a class of 50 or 60 kids, you can only learn by rote. There's nothing else you can do. If you have 60 kids in front of you, you literally have to repeat things, and the kids don't have to what you say. And so what a teacher can actually physically do in a class that size is very limited. So learning by rote is extremely common in these schools because there's no other option. Sorry?
What's rote? Just reading and listening?
Yeah, reading, listening, or I write things down, you copy down and learn it, or I say things out loud and you remember what I say and repeat after me, like that kind of stuff. Additionally, a lot of local authorities aren't actually able to provide secondary and technical schools. So technical schools are kind of schools that are kind of increasingly able to offer some sort of like just like my mind's just frozen. They're increasingly able to offer subjects that are more sort of skills-based, almost kind of like sort of like developing like work skills essentially. Like, I can't remember how to explain it. But yeah, even if it was like a second technical schools, yes, a lot of local authorities basically can't really provide secondary schools because they don't have the financial resources to actually provide them in the first place. So yeah, so there is regional variation in terms of education across the country. Last point, looking at the interval periods, in terms of limits to opportunity, are the access to university education. So, university education as well remains, if we look at the gender dynamics of it, and this is a point which you can make a note of it as well. If you are doing an essay on women, so if you get a specific question about women, you can talk about this point, as long as you link it specifically into women. So looking at the opportunities that are available to women, it's quite clear that access remains unequal to university. So university education remains a male and middle class preserve. And actually, if you look at the percentage of people who are actually in university at the time, under 25% are actually women in the first place. So less than a quarter of university places are going to women. And so obviously that's not necessarily because they're not allowed to go, it's because of the nature of the opportunities that are available to them. But then even if you look at some legal restrictions, the best example of this is Cambridge University. Cambridge, in this point, still does not grant full degrees to women. They will have some colleges that will accept women, but then even then they won't do sort of full courses. And so what they allow women to do is actually what they will allow women to do is actually very limited. So yes, the final point, if you're a woman in the interval period, access to higher education is still quite difficult and quite limited. If you're, So that's the interval period. Interval period for this topic is a slightly thinner one, a smaller one than it is in the post-war period. There aren't really that many more points to pick out. You could yourself go back through and have a look and see if there are others you can pick out, but those are the ones I've been able to. Sorry, oops. So, post-war. What I'm going to do for this is, I'm going to go back briefly to the Butler Act, because there was one point about the Butler Act which we didn't explain properly. So we're going to go over the Butler Act, the impact of the Butler Act, or rather this part of it, and then looking at how far specific educational reforms in the post-war period help create educational opportunity or not. So, one of the provisions we didn't talk about, or we sort of leave till later, and this is because because it only gets introduced or implemented after the Second World War. So you want to leave it for a question like this, is the tripartite system. This is the most important change, well, one of the most important changes of the Act, and has arguably the most significant legacy, which is that it creates this new system, this three-tier education system, known as the tripartite system. So, what basically happens is the following. It introduces an entrance exam that pupils sit at the age of 11 to determine what school they attend. It's called 11 plus. They sit this exam, and you either go to one of three schools. You go to either a grammar school. Grammar schools are basically highly academic education, or they provide highly academic education reserved for the highest scorers in the 11 plus. The top kids go to grammar schools, and you do really academic subjects, and yeah, you hopefully go on to university, which you should do. They then had secondary technical schools. And the idea behind this is they specialised in mechanical and technical education. So again, I'm trying to explain it again a second go. It's, learning things that will take you into, again, skills-based professions. So things like engineering, etc. So this is the second kind that's created. Having said that, in the end, very few technical schools are established. It's a very small number. Lastly then, the vast majority of schools that are created, and most kids will go to these schools, are the secondary modern. They all basically provide a general education, and it's for any kid who doesn't do well in the 11 plus, they all go to the secondary modern. And the vast majority of schools that are built are secondary moderns. So, what are the criticisms of this system? So I'm going to start with the criticisms first, and then I'll come back to some of the responses to the criticism. The Labour left was sharply critical of this system and saw it as socially quite divisive. The argument was that you're basically dividing kids between those who fail and those who don't, and actually what it does is if you fail the 11 plus, you basically condemn a student to a lifetime of inadequate education. And so instead, they wanted comprehensive education. When we say comprehensive education, what we mean is all students are educated together regardless of ability. Again, the idea being that if you, at 11 years old, you condemn a child for failing an exam, and there's also the argument, actually, again, it was a very inflexible system. What if a kid fails at 11, but they haven't matured academically as much, and they will sort of like develop later on? So it wasn't really seen as an accurate measure of predicting future potential. So again, it's an unfair way of deciding who goes where. Again, condemning a student to an inadequate education. And so, as a result, the actual kids themselves who went to secondary moderns were, it is true, hugely disadvantaged. If you look at the numbers, very few of the kids who went to these schools went on to take O-levels and A-levels, O-levels being the precursor to GCSE exams, so actual academic secondary qualifications, very few students actually took them in the first place if they went to secondary modern. Additionally, if you talk about the quality of education, you had very high staff turnover due to the situation in those schools. Staff couldn't really stay there for very long due to the nature of the students' behaviour, etc. And so you would have staff constantly leaving, and therefore leaving students with very little continuity in terms of who was teaching them, etc. Which again, disrupt their education. So the actual quality of the education received in secondary moderns was quite poor compared to grammar schools, and had a very negative effect on students that actually went there. So, in response to that, the Labour government comes up with a policy that comes to be known as the Crosland Circular. So what basically happens is the following. by the 1960s, the Labour left had been getting more and more critical of the inequality that the selective system was basically creating, and continued to argue for comprehensive education. However, obviously, if you know your dates very well, you'll know that for the entirety of the 50s, Labour was nowhere near power. So they, in opposition, had to sort of sit there and watch what was going on. So when Labour returned to power in 1964, under Howard Wilson's government, they issue a document called the Crosland Circular. And what it does is, it basically calls for comprehensive education. It basically brings an end to the selective system, or marks the beginning of the end of selective education. And to do it basically, or to enforce this ruling, they strip schools of funding if they do not comply with this system. So they make it much harder for schools to gain state funding if they do not turn into comprehensive schools. It's worth noting, Wilson's cabinet, who again, many of them were on sort of very far left, were very critical of grammar schools and actually wanted him to go further and were calling on him to actually abolish grammar schools entirely, which he didn't do. Because the way they saw it was, grammar schools would continue to exist in some form unless you abolish them. So he resists calls to do this. Having said that, by 1979, his policy of sort of trying to convert schools slowly into comprehensives is quite successful. If you look at the numbers, by 1979, 90% of students were now being educated in comprehensive schools, and it's because schools were being converted in very large numbers into comprehensives. So if you consider the very idea of comprehensive education to be a success and widening opportunity, then undoubtedly the increase in students attending them is a measure of that success. Additionally, and this I think a more valid point, is that students themselves, or a large number of students, were now able to leave school with qualifications. So, although the number of kids taking O-levels being the proper, full-on academic qualification at the age of 16, while the number of kids doing O-levels remained 20%, this new qualification called the CSE, the Certificate in Secondary Education, was created. A lot of students were able to take this alternative qualification as a result. And so, when they actually leave school at 16, they're actually able to leave and have some sort of qualification to show for, compared to none, which they would have in previous years. Additionally, other changes that were made is that schools were now able to arrange for work experience for students instead of lessons during their final year of school. So again, it made it easier. So this is what comprehensive schools were up to. And so it made it easier for some of the students in those schools to basically find work after they left. And so there's an argument to be made that actually comprehensive reform does help to widen educational opportunities for a range of students who previously would have been condemned under the tripartite system, having gone to secondary model.
Is that slide only for comprehensive?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. However, the criticisms, which I like to go into because I don't buy the whole thing. But no, it's true, like, there is a balanced point, and with the education debate is a very complicated one, and it's not so simple as to say comprehensives are great, grammar schools are evil. There's a couple of main points here, really. First things first, so Wilson basically, when he called for comprehensive education, he used this phrase where he said that comprehensive education meant that we would have grammar schools for all, okay? It didn't mean you were going to reduce the quality of schooling, it meant that every kid in the school would have the right to attend a grammar school, because comprehensives were going to have the same quality of education. However, the reality was that a large number of comprehensive schools resembled the secondary moderns that they had supposedly abolished, okay? And so when we say resembles them, if we think about the really poor discipline in secondary modern schools, the issues of staff turnover, and therefore lack of academic achievement as a result, lack of opportunity, that same issue persisted in large swathes of comprehensives. So this idea that comprehensive education improved the quality of the standards across the country is an exaggerated one. yes, they probably were slightly better than secondary moderns, but they often did resemble them. They often resembled them anyway. And then additionally, then what you add to that is, and then worse. So not only do they resemble secondary moderns, even worse. And this is probably the strongest argument against widening opportunity. Okay, if it's about opportunity, this is the strongest argument that it didn't do that. Grammar schools undoubtedly, for the few working class kids who got into them, created a really clear and strong route for social advancement. If you were a working class student who managed to do an 11 plus and get into a grammar school, it was a really good ladder basically for climbing the social ladder. And for most people, that was the only ladder. The only option you had for social advancement was to attend a grammar school due to the quality of the education that they actually provided. And so by abolishing them, you eliminate the sole route that thousands of working class students had for social advancement, and they are then condemned to attend these comprehensives, which, as I've just said, were arguably in many parts of the country just as bad as secondary moderns. And so you've not made education better for all, you've actually made it worse for quite a few. That's part of the argument against it. Additionally, the second side of it is you can argue that there was actually more inequality in the new system. The reason being is that not all students had to go to these new comprehensive schools. In abolishing grammar schools, many grammar schools chose to instead transform into private schools as opposed to turn into comprehensives when they lost their funding. So actually, again, to actually go there, you had to be slightly more wealthy. Additionally, if you were a wealthier parent, or a middle-class parent in many cases, your response to abolition of grammars wasn't to send your kids to the comprehensive, it's to send them to the private school. So the idea of there being an equality created, it's arguable that actually there was more inequality created, because actually, essentially, you had comprehensives or private schools. And many of those old grammar schools simply became private schools instead. So the selection became much more to do with wealth as opposed to academic ability. So arguably that was a more unequal system. So that's schools. The second major area again we keep talking about is the university access. So one of the main ways in which access to university basically improves or increases in this period, one of the main things that happens is the number of places massively expands. During the 1960s, over 20 universities are opened. And that's without even factoring in the many new polytechnic universities. So the polytechnics are these sort of like these. Actually, I'm not going to go into that. I'm not going to offend some people. But like, yeah, I mean, a lot of so you've got like 20 new universities which opened up in the 1960s that are very academic universities. I mean, even places like Warwick, which are like really, really top universities, basically originated in the 60s. So you have about 20 very academic, brand new universities opened up in the 1960s. Additionally, you also have the polytechnics, which less academic, more again focused on more sort of vocational courses, etc., of which a wide number pop up. And between those two, what you have, therefore, is a massive expansion in the number of places available for students to actually attend in the first place. And linked to that, you also have the expansion of state availability or cover for students' fees and to pay out grants. So again, it becomes easier for students to actually pay for university education in the first place. A really good example of an institution that's created in this period, because it's kind of symbolic of this change and this wider availability, is the Open University. So the Open University is created in this period, and the Open University basically takes lots of students. And what it does is it allows you to gain degrees through distance education and learning, and it's also more open to students of all ages. And so for a lot of people who've actually missed out on higher education, Open University represents an opportunity for people to actually have the opportunity again, or if, for example, they need to work and actually go to physically attend the university again, it provides opportunities for that. So the Open University is really endemic, or rather, I'm saying endemic is negative. It's symbolic of this expansion, and that it's this really clear way in which a wider variety of people are now able to access university education as a result of some of these changes. So finally then, it's kind of a recurring point that never kind of goes away, and it's still the case today. Social class still continues to be quite a controversial issue throughout the century, or towards the end of the century in terms of education. So if you look at the elite universities, in particular of course Oxford and Cambridge, as it was in the 20s, they continue to be dominated by students from public schools. If you go to public school or private school, the majority of those schools tend to still be overrepresented in higher education.
Is that supposed to be private school?
It's supposed to be public. Public is like, public schools are basically like the really traditional private schools. Actually, I do not know why they call them public schools.
Yeah.
Like, not every private school is a public school. Public schools are the really bad posh ones. That's like a really crude definition of public school. That's the best one I can give you right now.
Right, in posh private school.
Just good. Like public schools in places like Eton Harrow. Eton Harrow, Merchant Thames, from Lee.
Private school then.
I mean, like, the really traditional ones, basically. To our friends at UCS, I don't think they'd count as a public school. They're just a regular private school. Maybe they would, who knows? Maybe I'm like saying I'm sure. Google it. I'm not. Don't think the definition might be possible. Okay. So the other thing you can then link it to is this greater, or rather limited access to elite institutions. This arguably is made worse by the demise of the grammar schools. So you kind of linking that point to it. So again, for a lot of poor students, grammar schools were the best route to attend elite institutions, in particular getting into places like Oxford and Cambridge. So the demise of the grammar schools, again, it made a very highly successful route into these universities disappear for a large number of poor students across the country. And that brings that one to an end. So for this topic, that's the last one I'm going to go through. So for this topic, I think, like I said, it can tend to be quite straightforward in terms of the questions they ask. That's why in terms of the layout of how I've done this, I've literally focused it on that individual question. You want to go back, I think, and look in a bit more detail at what some of these things are, what some of these changes. You could, I think, potentially get a question about causation, or what the main cause of certain things happen, or you could get a question, I think, about the main consequences of certain acts, in particular in the post-war period. But yeah, I think this is more than any other topic. I think this is one that is most likely to be simply focused on that one question. The thing to watch out for is if they ask you a question that specifically is only about, say, school education or universities. I really doubt they do universities only. They might restrict it to only secondary or school, education in schools as opposed to further education. That's the thing to watch out for in that for that topic. But for that purpose, you might want to go back and just look at a few more points specifically about opportunities in schools, just to kind of, if that does come up, you've kind of got a few more points you can rely on. Otherwise, if it's a very broad question about educational opportunity, it becomes a much easier one, and you can talk about a lot more things. And that's a wrap for that one. Woo.